Thank you, Melissa, and thank you everyone for attending this presentation today. Patrick and I would like to talk to you a little bit about the research that we've been doing for the last 2 years. It has been an eye-opening and fascinating topic for me, and this is basically the agenda. We want to talk about general findings of our research surrounding SEO for digital repositories, but we also want to talk about a subset of our research, and that is how well Google Scholar indexes institutional repositories. And that's the subject of the paper that was just published a couple of weeks ago called Invisible Institutional Repositories, published in Library High Tech. So we have been digitizing materials at the University of Utah for over 10 years, and we have a substantial collection. We have virtually every format of digital material that you can think of, including a very large digital newspapers collection. About 3 or 4 years ago, my staff and I started to notice that we weren't appearing, our digital collections weren't appearing in internet search engines as well as we thought we were. And the more we dug, the more we realized that we had a big problem on our hands. We tried to address this problem ourselves, but we didn't have a lot of success. And then Patrick OBrien came on board with us and started to put some real numbers behind the problem, and has really done a tremendous job in helping us raise our indexing ratios in Google, and we've made substantial progress for our IR in Google Scholar as well. And so toward the latter part of this presentation, we're going to be talking to you about several pilot projects that we did with Google Scholar and OCLC to try to raise those indexing ratios, and we'll show you specifically what we did to get there. So just to back up a second and make sure we're all on the same page, what we're talking about here is not SEO for general websites. There's a lot that's been researched and published about that topic. In fact, you can go out on the web and find any number of sites that will give instructions, good or bad, about how to raise your indexing ratios for general websites. What we're talking about, and what has been much less, I think, researched and published about so far, is SEO for digital repositories, and we are including the IR in this. So we have 2 priorities for our research. One is to increase our reach, in other words, simply get our digital objects into the search engines. And then the second priority is to increase the visibility once they're there, in other words, to increase our rankings. We want to appear, of course, on the first couple of pages in a Google search result rather than on page 20 or 30, because we know nobody goes there. As we've done this research, we have both in initial preparation and then in writing a successful grant proposal to IMLS, and then most recently in publishing our paper, we've done reviews of the literature. And what we found is that most of the literature out there is dated. Most of it deals with general websites. There are very few articles so far, as I said, about digital repositories and SEO, and some of the articles that we did find even suggested duplicating digital content outside the database or outside the repository. In other words, creating static pages for the object, and that's just not a very scalable solution. A few weeks ago, the preprint of our article got out on the web, and it caused a little bit of a stir on several discussion lists. And most of the discussion was very good, but in reading responses, as this got passed around, we started to worry a little bit that some of the basic findings and the most crucial findings of our research was being missed. There's an article, we decided to write a response to this, and we posted it out on the web on a couple of these lists. I realize that URL at the bottom of the screen is long and difficult. This presentation will be available from OCLC later, so you can get it later if you want to, or if you just go out to Google and search for author's response and put in one of our names, you'll find the full text of our response. But just to highlight a few crucial findings that we want to make sure don't get missed in this. The first of these is that technology is only a piece of the SEO puzzle. And in fact, in some cases, it's a relatively small piece. We feel that search engine optimization has to be dealt with from leadership, management, and land management perspectives, and that communication across groups in the library is hugely important. Only some of the stakeholders and some of the problems are based in IT departments. And if there's only one thing that you take away, one general idea that you take away from this presentation today, it's this. Search engine crawlers have to be able to access your content easily, and once they access it, they have to be able to interpret that content as machine-readable data. Those seem like very simple concepts, but this is what surprises us again and again. You can have the best repository software out there for SEO purposes, but if you build a site around it that obfuscates crawlers, then you've just defeated the whole purpose of the software.
Or if you put in metadata that isn't consistent, or you don't mark it in a machine-readable way, once they do find the page, they're not going to be able to understand it or interpret it.
So we just wanted to get these points out there in advance. I think human nature being what it is, people want easy answers to what are often complex issues. So we've had quite a lot of success in getting our indexing ratio raised in Google's main index. And that's another important point right off the bat, realizing that Google and Google Scholar are two separate indexes, and even actually two separate organizations. So what we're showing right here is our indexing ratio for our digital collections in Google's main index. We started off in July of 2010 with an average indexing ratio across all of our collections of about 12%. We also looked separately at some of our larger collections, in other words, those with over 500 URLs, and our indexing ratio for those, we achieved a high of 37% in July of 2010. By April of 2011, we had made some significant progress. We had raised our average indexing ratios to 51%, and the highs for that subset of large collections was up to 87%. And then by November of last year, we had reached almost 80% average and 100% as a high indexing ratio for our largest collection. So we're doing something right, clearly, and we're having success. Now, the very real result of getting more of our objects indexed by Google has led to increased visits. So these two tables give some metrics from WebTrends, which is a website analytics software that we have used for several years, but that we're basically migrating away from in favor of Google Analytics. But this view, the first table, shows you a comparison of roughly the same 12-week period in 2010 versus the same period in 2011. You can see that there was a 200% increase in referrals from Google. And that has translated in the second table to a very real increase in the number of visitors. You can see we have had an 80% increase in visitation as a result of that.
So one of the things,
sorry, don't mind. We want to talk a little bit about the issues that we see and the reasons for doing SEO in the first place. This is a chart that should be recognizable to a lot of you. This is a study that OCLC conducted in 2005 where they asked students where they begin their research. And 89% of college students responded by saying that they begin their research using internet search engines. Way down at the bottom of that chart are library websites coming in at 2%. Only 2% of college students begin their research at library websites. OCLC did the study again in 2010 with much the same results. You can see the search engine use fell a little bit from 89 to 83%, but for the first time we're seeing Wikipedia and social networking sites as places, sources where students go to begin their research. And most disconcerting for us is that the library website as a source for beginning research fell to 0, at least in this study. It doesn't mean that nobody's going to library websites. It just means that students aren't necessarily beginning their research there. And what these two charts tell us is that if our digital collections are not indexed in Google or other search engines, students will not find them. Most of our research thus far has been focused on Google, and we think for very good reason. Bing, of course, is a strong upcoming contender in the internet search engine market, and there are a few other search engines, general purpose search engines still around, but Google holds the majority of the market share. This figure of 66.2% market share has been relatively consistent over the last few years. Microsoft and Yahoo together make up close to another 30% of the general search engine market. So when we first realized that we had a problem at the University of Utah, we hoped like hell that we weren't the only ones having the problem. So we started to look around, and we help to manage a distributed digital library here in the western United States called the Mountain West Digital Library. It covers Utah, Nevada, a little bit of Idaho too. And at that time, in October of 2010, there were 13 hosting repositories for the Mountain West Digital Library. We went to each one of those repositories and randomly pulled out 50 items, and then tried to find each of those 50 items for each of the 13 repositories in Google, and we searched them by title. So it was a known item search. And the ratio, the average indexing ratio that we came out with was about 38%. However, this 38% included indirect URLs. And I'll explain what that means in a second, but take notice of this. The Utah Digital Newspapers repository showed pretty well in this survey at 76% indexing ratio. This included indirect URLs. So if an indirect URL, if you get a search result in Google or another search engine and you click on that search result, an indirect URL will take you to another set of search results in the repository. What we really want to do is connect people directly to the digital object. So when we removed the indirect URLs from that chart, the average indexing ratio for the Mountain West Digital Library went all the way down to 13%. And that was pretty, well, in one way it was reaffirming, in another way it was appalling. But notice here what happened to the Utah Digital Newspapers repository. It went from the top of the list down to the bottom of the list, saying there were virtually no direct URLs from the Utah Digital Newspapers repository appearing in internet search engines. So this was a problem.
So one of the things we started to look at was how do you, as Kenny said, things are, there's a lot written about SEO out there, but one of the challenges was how do we do this so that it is sustainable with inside the organization? The key thing is SEO is not a snapshot in time. It's something that you need to work at constantly. So we started to look at how do you do that? So this is somewhat prescriptive in that the first thing you need to start doing is looking at your stakeholders and what they value. So we started to break that down into, in a sense, faculty and archivists, and focusing on what we can do objectively to demonstrate value. And if you think about faculty, we want to start looking at things that are going to, metrics that are going to be relevant to them to demonstrate value, starting with the first things of like publication page views, all the way down to if we can demonstrate publication citations are increasing through the IR, there's going to be a lot more interest and participation. The idea is that the sooner a scholarly work is available on the internet and the more visible it is, the likely it will be discovered and cited. On the other hand, archivists, again, starting with pages indexed, back to if you're not indexed in the search engine, things like donors aren't going to come to you and say, how come we can't find our stuff? So that's a starting point, all the way down to if your organization has, for example, reproductions ordered, where people are requesting reproductions, or perhaps you can influence the number of contacts of people coming in to view the physical collection. So the key thing is getting the library staff to start to think about what drives value inside the library organization. So the next thing you want to do is set up your goals and establish a baseline. And in doing that, very simple, we started off with increase the number of digital collection web pages in the Google search engine. We wanted to start to develop the internal staff library skills around awareness and then how to manage that, and then eventually get into maximizing the collection's visibility and reach to relevant target audiences. So we started with a pilot, and when you start with a pilot, you want to pick something that's relevant to your leadership, and one of that is the EAD finding aid.
So just to clarify and make sure everybody understands what a finding aid is, when a collection comes into a library's special collections or an archives, the archivists will organize that collection and divide it up into boxes and folders. It may be letters, it may be documents from a certain person. And the finding aid, they then write a finding aid to describe what's in all of those boxes and folders. And EAD, encoded archival description, is the tagging scheme for making finding aids machine readable.
In a sense, it's your table of contents and index. It's the window into what's in the collection, and it's a key tool researchers use to understand what's in the collection. And so we wanted to start with something that is important to the leadership, but we didn't want to be successful on something nobody cared about or a small group cared about.
And we actually had donors who had contributed collections to special collections who a year or 2 years later couldn't find their collections in Google, and they were complaining to our archivists about it.
So we started with that, and we went ahead and made an impact, a significant impact, that grabbed attention. I think these are current results. I think in our original pilot, and it was about a 6-week period, we had gotten from 2%, I think, in the 50s or 60s, which again demonstrated that with some effort, you can make a difference. So again, that was our first set of goals, but as we started to move forward, we wanted to make sure that we were talking about developing a program that indexing is not enough. It's once we're indexed, how do we make sure that we're getting found by people that's relevant? So in doing that, the next thing you have to do is ensure your staff understands the strategic importance of the effort. And we went through the library strategic plan and started to look for how are we going to impact these high-level vision and making sure the leadership was aware that we play a role, and at the same time, the managers that were involved in achieving that strategic plan understood that we were there to help, and that there was communication, and it wasn't just a side project. This has had real value to the organization, and that once we started to do this, I think the staff started to get more interested. The leadership definitely provided support at this point. So from that, the next thing you want to do is you need to educate the staff about what search engines value. Again, the perspective when I first got here was they were thinking about what they typically did internal to the library. They weren't thinking about what search engines did. So they got the information from faculty and from archivists and donors, and they put it into the CMS, and they wanted to know, Google, Bing, and Yahoo bring us your masses, and it didn't. So you have to ask, what do they value? And the first question is, are you worthy enough for their customer? The indexing question, just like a retailer. They only have so much shelf space, and if you're difficult to crawl and are difficult to work with, the retailer's not going to carry your product. So that's the first hurdle. You have to demonstrate that they can find information quickly and easily on your website. The next question is, once that retailer's carrying your information, then you're fighting for that eye-level shelf space when the customer walks in. And if you can't demonstrate value relevant to the searcher, it's again, the retailer's thinking, do I put them at eye-level shelf space when they walk in the door, or are they going to be in the back of the warehouse, under a dusty tarp? It's the difference between being, number 5 on the first page and number 5 on the 100th page of the search result. So once you start thinking this way, people can become self-directed and start to think in those terms. The other key thing is, once you start doing this, you have to understand their policies and practices. And they change all the time, and it's important to monitor those.
So as Patrick said earlier, SEO is not a one-time thing. You don't just make some changes and then sit back and reap the fruits. You have to continually monitor. And OAI harvesting and sitemaps are 2 examples of that. There was a time when Google supported OAI harvesting, Open Archives Initiative protocol for metadata harvesting. And at that time, we believed that our indexing ratios were pretty good because our repository was OAI compliant. In August of 2008, Google announced that it was no longer going to support OAI. And we think that after that, our numbers started to tank. And so that's an example where Google made a unilateral decision as to what protocol they were going to support, and it affected us dramatically. Another example was with sitemaps. We had, as many people do, submitted sitemaps to Google, and Google had an unenforced rule that sitemaps should reside at the root of the server. We had our sitemaps in a subdirectory called sitemaps. Made sense to us. In August of 2010, Google suddenly decided it was going to enforce that rule. And it just so happened that Patrick had decided to take his vacation at the same time. So the numbers that had been increasing, our indexing ratios that had been increasing, suddenly took a nosedive again, and we had to backpedal and figure out what the problem was. And once we moved our sitemaps into the root directory, things started to get better again. A couple of other examples of how we are, to some degree, at the mercy of the search engines if we want them to index our materials. Google Scholar announced within the last year or so that Dublin Core tags should not be used for institutional repository materials. Our IR, of course, uses Dublin Core to describe our content, and I think many IR repositories use it as well. Instead of Dublin Core, Google wants Highwire Press, Prism, bpress, or ePrints metadata schemas. And the reason they want this is that Dublin Core cannot express bibliographic citations very well. It doesn't have enough individual fields for all the parts of a bibliographic citation. And again, this is where it comes down to the machine-readable part. Our IR metadata, of course, is very human-readable, but we need to make it machine-readable for Google Scholar to understand.
So once the staff starts to understand those types of things, the first thing you're going to want to do is make sure, or one of the first things you want to do is get into the Webmaster Tools. Google is probably the first place you want to start. Bing also has one. And start to ask questions, particularly around crawl errors. People aren't going to necessarily know what the answers are, but you need to ask the question, should we be having errors, and is that the right number? For example, that's a lot of errors for pages we don't want crawled by robots text.
And this is a great example of where communication comes into play. In our particular case, we had a server administrator set up the robots.txt file, and then we had a different person, a programmer, submit the sitemaps. And those two guys didn't talk to each other. And it turns out that the sitemaps were saying to Google, yeah, come on in, and here are our URLs, index all this stuff. And then Google was hitting our server, and the robots.txt file was saying, nope, sorry, you can't come in here. And that was throwing off tens of thousands of errors.
And again, it's not a problem to have some errors, but in certain areas, you don't want them. For example, the HTTP errors are things that you don't want. But start to ask the questions, because as management, if you don't ask the questions, nobody's going to care to get them answered. The other thing is to look at in there is look at your server performance and look for big ups and downs and ask why. Because again, is it changing? What happened? Why is this occurring? And because performance, the search engines use between 200 to 300 what are called signals. And they all have different weights on how you're going to get indexed, where you're going to get placed in the search results. And performance, Google announced, I would say in the last year or 2 years, that is a signal that they're using, and it is important. And because people don't want to wait around to get to the website. It provides a poor customer experience.
So this particular chart that you're looking at in Webmaster Tools shows that our server performance was not optimal. It was pretty slow. In fact, Google is telling us we're slower than 63% of sites. Where we want to be is down in that bottom, in that green zone, the 1 second or less response.
So the other thing is as people become aware of this, obviously if you're looking at numbers, they can be a good thing and they can be a bad thing. Because if people start to do things strictly around the numbers, you can get yourself into very big trouble with the search engines. They have a set of policies that they enforce very rigorously.
There was New York Times did a story on JCPenney about a year and a half or so ago. JCPenney had employed an SEO firm that used some tactics to get JCPenney ranked more highly in Google search results, and they were quite successful. JCPenney was showing up everywhere, and the SEO firm was doing this by seeding all kinds of unrelated websites with JCPenney material. So once Google found out about this, almost overnight, JCPenney's results dropped from any search results and appeared much, much further down. And it took them a while to rebuild that credibility.
And they do eat their own dog food. For example, Google Chrome very recently was doing an ad campaign, and they hired a firm that violated these policies. The two big policies are paying for links. If you violate that, that's a very bad thing, or linking to what are called link farms, or a bad neighborhood, sometimes referred to. Google Chrome was doing these things. When the search engine guys found out, Google Chrome dropped off of the results until they fixed their issues. So I felt bad for the product manager and that product team. It's pretty embarrassing. The other thing is, again, understanding those policies of seriously what can get you banned or penalized.
Because once you get kicked out of an index, it's tough to get back in. All right, so let's turn our attention to Google Scholar and institutional repositories. When we first began to realize that we were not performing well in Google Scholar, in fact, we were performing horribly in Google Scholar, we got a little bit of pushback in our own institution about why, so what? Why is it such a big deal? Why does Google Scholar matter? And so we went back to the literature, and we found that even when Google Scholar was first launched in 2004, it probably wasn't a very significant source of material for researchers. But that's changed. That's changing significantly, and faculty, graduate students, researchers use Google Scholar a lot now, and so it does matter if your institutional repository material appears there.
I wanted to point out one thing why I believe we got a little pushback on Google Scholar was it wasn't about the technology, probably for the first time. It was about how we were entering metadata and applying metadata, and our interpretation of how to apply that metadata, and it was going to require a great amount of work to how we entered and organized our metadata. So I think that was one of the...
Right, so they were wondering about what's the value versus the cost.
And again, I'm a strong advocate that all this stuff doesn't get fixed with technology.
Yes. So here's a snapshot of our institutional repository collections, or 4 of our institutional repository collections. The first 2 are electronic theses and dissertations. Used ScholarWorks tends to be the articles that faculty and staff publish, and then Board of Regents is more of an administrative materials collection in the IR. In July of 2010, we were getting, our IR collections were getting indexed an average of about 18%. The ETD2 collection at that point did not even exist, so that's why it was at 0. Now this is in Google's index, okay, not Google Scholar. So we were performing poorly in Google's index, but not nearly as poorly as in Google Scholar, which was at 0.
So we started to look at why was this occurring, and just so you know, Google providing tools like Webmaster Tools, analytics, or even feedback such as this is relatively new. They were kept all this information. You know, we were always guessing. So we started to look at this, and the key thing is using the right metadata tags and consistently applying that metadata seemed to be the primary issue. And as, you know, we have pages of these types of things of what occurs, but the example that they kept stressing was making sure that your site was easily crawlable and that you had correct bibliographic citation information and that it was machine understandable.
So we started to do some more survey research, again, to put some data into place and make sure it wasn't just us. And the first survey that we did yielded some interesting results, but not for the reasons that we originally thought. The way we did this, we looked at a number of different repositories across the country, IRs, and we got their URLs, and then we used the site operator in Google to try to figure out their indexing ratio. And that means that you go to Google Scholar and you type in site : and then the repository URL. And that yielded this set of results. However, it didn't mean what we initially thought it meant. Using the site operator is not a good way to determine indexing ratio. Instead, the usefulness of this graph is that it shows us which of these repositories have primary material in them. In other words, a primary item, a primary link, is material that is not found elsewhere. So Baylor, for instance, is doing a very good job of populating their repository with material that hasn't been published elsewhere. And it leads to some very interesting questions about the purpose of institutional repositories. Should we just be duplicating what's already available elsewhere? So we went back and put some more data in place, doing it the longer and harder way. From those that previous chart, we looked more closely at 7 institutional repositories. And this time, we used real crawler software to try to crawl through those repository sites. We pulled out somewhere between 550 items to about 4,000 items for each of the repositories. And then from that, we took a sampling of 40, a randomized sample from 40 of each of the repositories, and we searched for those 40s from each of the 7 repositories in Google Scholar, one at a time by title, to see if we could find them. And this was the result. There are some repositories that are performing very well, have a very high indexing ratio, and there are some that are not performing very well. And we believe the reason is a combination of factors. First of all, Google Scholar recommends specific crawler guidelines. This is where it comes down to how easy are you making it for crawlers to navigate through your repository. So Google, for instance, wants a page that allows it to browse by date. It also wants a recently added or chronological page, and it wants the PDFs, or whatever the ultimate object is, to be 10 clicks or fewer from the home page. It also wants to have a well-formed robots.txt file, and it wants sitemaps submitted, and it wants a sitemap index of all the sitemaps that you have submitted. And you can see in that first set of crawling guidelines, there are the repositories that tend to follow these more tend to do a little bit better than the ones that don't. Now, the other factor that comes into this, the other large factor, is indexing guidelines. And this is where the difference between using Dublin Core and not using Dublin Core comes into play.
Well, the other thing I wanted to point out on the crawling guidelines, when we're using the software, the items, the repositories on the right in the brownish shading were very difficult for us to crawl. You'll notice the sample, the number of things that we could crawl or find were smaller, and again, just getting access to those pages were very difficult. So that was one of the anecdotal experiences as well.
So what this chart shows, or this table shows, is that it's a combination of factors, but they can be broken down into two main areas, crawling guidelines and indexing guidelines. Again, Google Scholar wants to see metadata schema that do a better job of making the data machine readable and allowing Google Scholar to parse it into different fields. And the other thing to point out here is that this issue cuts across repository software, as you can see in that second row.
So the big challenge is when you're a search engine crawler or a search engine can't see, so it only can view the text, and then it doesn't understand the text. This is human readable information at this point. So the crawler comes to the page. This is an example of the text on one of our IR pages, and it's got to chew through this information, and we're talking about a lot of information towards the bottom of the page, and it has to know that that is the citation. And there's really no way to know that we're using that as our citation. Us as humans can figure this out. So what happens is, not only does it have to know that that's the citation, there's a lot of information in this one field, and it doesn't understand that there's two authors. The publication date's 2006. It doesn't know the difference between the title and the publishing institution, and so on and so forth, because the standard we're using to organize our citation is going to be different across repositories. So it's a very difficult task to do that. And what we had to do is to turn this citation into something that was machine understandable for Google Scholar. And that's what it looks like. So we had to use a standard in which they want the information put into what's called a meta tag in the header of the file. And if you don't do it that way, they can't recognize that this is being addressed to them, and they can digest it. And then we use the citation, which is Highwire Press's interpretation of how you parse this information out, so it knows what the title is, what the date is, where the PDF is, and so on. So this is what machine understandable code, but again, this is for Google Scholar. Google uses something else.
I think another important point to make here is that search engine crawlers do not actually crawl through databases. What they do is trigger the generation of pages from the database. So they'll click on a URL, essentially, just like a person would. The page will be assembled from the database, and then the search engine crawler will read what's on that page and what's in the HTML headers. And that's why it's important to make sure that the metadata is inserted by means of a script from the database into the HTML headers.
And the other thing to point out is, this is what the machine sees, but that you also have to make sure that that is consistent with what the human sees, because if there's inconsistencies of what you're providing the crawler and what the user is seeing, penalty on the main search engines. So you need to make sure that when you're providing things in machine readable information, that the user is seeing the exact same thing, or else you can get into trouble with the major search engines. So the challenge that we did a number of pilots to try and figure this out. And the first one we did was say, how do we get our metadata? And this is where we got the first pushback, was we have to take thousands of these citations and convert them into Dublin Core tags, because we were using Dublin Core. That was the easiest way to go. And so we had to map that out. And so that was our first step, and that was our first pilot. The second pilot we did was, let's try it with Highwire Press tags. So then we had to map Dublin Core tags to Highwire Press tags. And it wasn't easy. So the first pilot was, we used about 6,500 URLs in the IR, submitted those into Google Scholar Webmaster Tools, there were a lot of errors generated. Again, this is in the very beginning of our SEO program, and we started to address and analyze those. We updated and corrected metadata for 20 articles, specifically following the guidelines. Particularly, they have guidelines around how they want the PDF. They want a single file, OCR, full text, that is less than 5 megabytes. So we had some work to do there. They have to be able to find it from the home page and so forth. So we made those changes, or our understanding of those changes, in the first pilot. And again, this is where we started with our baseline. By November of 2010, we got some pretty big increases in the main Google index. And then by 2011, we were doing fantastic in the main Google index. And but we were still at 0 with Google Scholar. And we started asking the question why, and we couldn't figure it out. And so Kenny.
So we started talking to OCLC, where I did a sabbatical last year, and OCLC has a very good relationship with Google Scholar. And so we were able to have some mediated conversations with people from Google Scholar. And so we tried again.
So we set up a separate pilot. Again, we want to suggest that kids don't do this at home, because our first pilot we used a desktop machine and it didn't have ups and things like that. But we took 19 papers. We identified 6 of 7 Google Scholar paper types, and we used 19 full-text PDFs. We used Content DM version 6 because that version had a lot of feature sets in it that addressed a lot of SEO issues. And we used Highwire Press meta tags. We augmented, we had an early version of version 6, so we added some things to do browse by year, some recently added, and some information about college and department. And before we lost power over a holiday, we got up to 62%. And what happens is if you don't have good server uptime, you get purged from these indexes pretty quickly. So we were able to get to 62%. So then we did it again because we wanted to run at least a full month. So we expanded the pilot to 56 papers. And we went to the USpace IR, which is the University of Utah's IR, and we made sure we found 56 papers that were not in the Google Scholar Index. And again, we did 6 of the 7 Google Scholar paper types, and we made sure we had 100% server uptime.
At least desktop uptime.
Yeah. And we got the indexing ratio for this pilot up to 90%. And so we're in the process of now migrating quite a few. I think we're over 10,000 citations to this type of structure. So the key thing that we need to understand, though, is there are different paper types, and we were, for example, a preprint is not a journal article, and we were going through, and even though the preprint and the journal article have the same citation title, we needed to make sure that we put metadata in differently. We can't just put metadata that's the journal article because, again, the preprint is not the journal article. And in doing so, for example, the citation date is different. The citation publisher and journal title for the journal article is one thing. The preprint, in a sense, is a technical report because it's being put out by the repository. It doesn't have a technical report number, but we would use different machine-readable code to give Google Scholar an understanding it's a preprint, it's not a journal article. Again, these are the key differences. These are the things that we had to change, and technology is not going to solve this problem for us.
And these are just 2 paper types, 2 of the 7 paper types represented here. We have the other 5 listed in our paper.
Correct. And, you know, and it depends on the paper type of what meta tags you're using, and again, making sure that we interpret it properly.
So we were funded for an IMLS National Leadership Grant last fall. It's a 3-year grant to continue doing this research, and we can see there is a lot more research to do having to do with the semantic web and ontologies and so forth. And so there's a lot of work ahead of us. We are working with OCLC on this. We want to expand the research. We want to publish a toolkit. In particular, we really want to try to figure out how to develop an automated metadata transformation mechanism so that the transformation of metadata from Dublin Core to Highwire Press or something else can happen in an automated fashion. And then, of course, we want to disseminate our findings as we're doing right now. So let's just summarize quickly what you can do to improve indexing ratios. And these are just some very basic things. Get some metrics, establish some baseline data, and figure out where you are right now. Configure Google Analytics in conjunction with Google's Webmaster Tools. They're both very powerful, free tools that will give you a lot of very good information. Submit sitemaps to Google. Make sure they don't conflict with your robots.txt file. Monitor errors and address them as they come up.
Particularly in the Webmaster Toolkit.
Make sure your staff have an understanding of the issues and assign them ownership. Clean up metadata. One of the things that we touched only lightly on in this presentation is that unique metadata is very important. If you have 30 pictures of a horse and they all have the same title that says horse or man on horse, Google's going to stop indexing that after a few.
The other thing that you want to look at and see quite often is 2 meta tags are the title and the description. Those titles need to be unique, and the description is important for click-through. So if whatever your software you're using, just make sure that you configure it so that the title appears.
And then finally, upgrade your repository software, because as vendors become more aware of these issues, they are providing better software. But remember that repository piece the software piece is only one part of this.
And the other part is apply your patches and so forth, because what's happening nowadays is if you don't have the software current, you could be exposed to malware, and that's becoming a big factor in the search engine algorithms.
Okay, thank you very much for listening, and we'd be happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Kenning and Patrick. There have been a couple of questions posted. The first one was earlier on in the webinar, and it is, I'm wondering how you define an indirect URL.
Yeah, let me just speak to that again quickly. An indirect URL is if you get a search result in Google and you click on one of those results and it takes you out to a repository and into another set of results rather than taking you directly to the object, that's an indirect URL.
The key issue is the user then has to search through another set of another set of search results to figure out what it is that they're looking for.
Thank you. The next question is, can your mappings of your Dublin Core fields to Highwire Press fields be used by other institutions?
Yes, of course. In fact, that's, if you look at in the appendix of the paper that we just published, all the 7 paper types are there with the mappings.
That's the purpose of it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not a very well publicized standard. It may not even be an open standard, but it's not a proprietary one.
Right, and it's something that worked for us. And again, it wasn't easy to figure out, and it certainly wasn't easy to figure out without OCLC's help.
Thank you. How are your rankings in Google and Google Scholar? Are you in the top 10 or only on page 2?
That's something we haven't really focused on yet, and the reason is if you get caught up into any SEO person that's telling you that they're going to get you #1 rankings, you're probably going to want to steer clear because they're probably using techniques that are going to get you in trouble. The idea is if you do good practices that are being published, particularly in Webmaster Tools and by Google Scholar, good things will happen. If you start to game the system, you're going to get yourself into trouble. And that's why I'm avoiding those types of conversations.
Thank you. There were several comments that a toolkit would be fantastic, so several people looking forward to that. Also a question, so the standard Dublin Core is changing?
What's the question exactly?
So the standard DC is changing.
The Dublin Core, apparently there's an extension that you can do to Dublin Core. If you look in the results, there was one institution, IR, that was using Dublin Core that indexed well. It is possible, but Google's advice was use it as a last resort. And we weren't successful with it. But there's a way apparently to extend Dublin Core, but I think it's called Dublin Core Terms. But the reason we used Highwire Press is because it's what was displayed as an example on Google Scholar, so it was easier to decipher and map out.
And as for Dublin Core changing, we are aware that there is now a field in the qualified Dublin Core called bibliographic citation, but it's still only one field. It's a qualification of the identifier field, but it's still only one field, so it doesn't really help with parsing out the parts of a citation.
The other thing that's occurring right now is the semantic web, and schema.org and things like that are critical components. The challenge is, particularly for IRs, schema.org is not precise enough to handle bibliographic information. So we're stuck with using these other publisher industry schemas. So that's what we have to work with on Google Scholar. The thing you want to look at is schema.org. There's a microdata format, and then they just started supporting our RDFA, which is going to play a big role in linked data concepts. So that's the direction that we need to go as a industry or segment, and that's where we're starting to take our research.
Thank you. What if a search takes you to the record for an item that contains the direct URL? Is that still considered an indirect URL?
To the record for an item. No, I think I would consider that a direct URL.
Yeah, as long as the user is getting a page that's relevant and they don't have to search through a list of other search results.
Right.
Because people don't want that when they do their search. The search engine and the user want the content that's going to solve the problem they've typed into the search engine. And if they have to do any more effort in finding that, they're going back to the search engine, which is called a bounce rate, where a user goes to the page and they go, that's not what I was looking for. They go back to the engine, and the engine then starts to move you down in your results because the user didn't find it helpful.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and that is, have you studied other citation metrics that faculty value and made a change to those values?
I'm sorry, say again?
Have you studied other citation metrics that faculty value and made a change to those values?
No, not yet.
No, not yet.
I mean, that's, you know, this is really like a can of worms. And that is another good direction for us to take the research.
To go back to, if the user lands on a page, direct, indirect URL, if they land on a page that describes the image or the digital object, that's useful because going directly to the image, again, typically the challenge is putting that descriptive metadata around it. Without the metadata, that image sometimes isn't very useful. So yes, going directly to a page that describes the digital object is very useful to the user, and we would call that a direct URL.
Well, thank you very much. We are out of time, so thank you both for a really interesting presentation. For those of you on WebEx, if you have any additional questions you think of for Kenning or Patrick, please feel free to email them directly. And we will post the slides and the recording of this webinar within the next week or so on our website and in iTunes. So thanks again for attending, and this concludes today's webinar.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.